1939. With the Second World War begun only months ago, and with the incursion of the unknown threat to humanity dubbed Morgana, the European nation of Norway made an innocuous request that the International Naval Protection Force, or INPF, be leased Norway's coastal naval bases. This would allow for the usage of neutral ports by all members of the INPF fleet, including Britain, France, and Germany. Debate about the consequences of this raged for 2 weeks, until the League of Nations voted that the port of Narvik in the far northern fjords would be chosen as an international Wild West. Debate about the consequences of this raged for weeks, until the League of Nations voted that the port of Narvik in the far northern fjords would be chosen as an international Wild West, where all member nations could make free use of the port for whatever purposes they needed, so long as the neutrality was maintained within Narvik itself. This would facilitate the usage of its facilities by belligerent nations, as well as allow for trade through the nation. The Allies were determined to support Finland at the time, while remaining uneasy about German usage of the port to acquire Swedish iron and steel. Another 2 weeks later saw all 7 great powers commit land and even naval forces to the defense of the port, some for geopolitical purposes and others for a show of capability and force. As fears and reluctance for any one nation to overshadow another in Narvik arose, only a small land force was allowed to be sent. Thus, each great power stationed a small contingent of their chosen soldiers, while Japan, Italy, and the Soviet Union stationed naval vessels in support of the city. A month passed without incident, but fears within the Allies continued to grow. Norway's neutrality and usage of the port of Narvik would potentially allow Germany to gain an advantage in the war, something the Allied powers could not tolerate. At the end of January 1940, the British government reached a shocking conclusion: that the continued independence of Norway was an unacceptable threat to British safety. A plan was approved by the British Parliament, with the next step being whether or not to involve their allies in France and Poland. By the beginning of March, Britain and France were aligned in their plan to invade Norway. A British force would accompany the larger French Second Army, under command of General Charles Hunsinger, in the invasion, a force of tens of thousands of men. Certain that Germany was imminently about to invade Norway itself, the Allies hoped to secure control in the country first, and tie down a large portion of the German army in the north to weaken the inevitable invasion of France. The final detail to decide was the invasion route itself. Britain and France opted to sail in a combined fleet, in order to avoid the bulk of the German and Morgana forces. Should any Norwegian ships abandon Norway to the INPF, they would be allowed to leave their country. Finally, all the pieces were in place. The Allies had planned their invasion, and on the week of March 29th, executed their plan. Unbeknownst to them, however, the Germans had been listening. The British invasion fleet consisted of 4 battleships, being Rodney, Nelson, Ramillies, and Royal Sovereign, the aircraft carrier HMS Furious, 1 heavy cruiser, 5 light cruisers, and 25 destroyers. Accompanying them were 23 armored merchant ships for supply, scouting, and net laying, 5 minesweepers, 7 sloops, and 2 submarine tenders to support 15 landing submarines. Their troops were escorted aboard 7 transport ships, totaling 40,000 troops. The invasion would begin in the dead of night, to take the Norwegians by surprise in the morning. The French fleet consisted of the battleship Condorcet, 4 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 2 seaplane tenders, 3 large destroyers, and 4 standard destroyers. Accompanying them were 2 icebreakers, 1 net layer, 7 small escorts, and a submarine tender for 3 submarines. French soldiers were escorted aboard 21 transports and 16 armed merchant ships, totaling just over 80,000 troops. Opposing the Allies was a small German submarine force, consisting of 4 patrols totaling 11 U-boats, with an additional 2 minesweepers operating in the area. The Allies rendezvoused to the northwest of the Hebrides. Almost immediately, the French fleet detected a minefield between them and the rendezvous, but expert seamanship and detection allowed them to navigate around the minefield and meet up with their British counterparts. U-18, waiting near the Orkneys, never spotted the fleet she had attempted to intercept, and was forced to return home without firing. Having met up together, the Allied fleets began their journey to Norway. The 7th Cruiser Squadron and 19th Destroyer Flotilla reported no unusual sightings in their spearhead recon, and there were no sightings of Germans nor Morganas. What the fleet did not detect was the minefield it had unknowingly sailed into. When the British merchant ship Montclair and French escort La Malpenée both sailed into mines, sending them below the water, both fleets began demining operations. The Royal Navy, with its superior training, was able to clear its path of mines with the help of its sweepers, but the French Navy had no such luck. No mines were detected unless inadvertently detonated, the next being destroyer Les Mars. The icebreakers Castor and Pollux, both on minesweeping duties, were separated when Pollux sailed into yet another mine, sending the French ship under the waves. Through the hard work of the remaining minesweepers, the British and French were able to clear the minefield and rescue as many who had gone overboard as possible. Another German U-boat, U-15, had set up much of these German mines and was still waiting for the convoy to sail towards her. She was unable to detect them, however, due to malfunctioning periscopes, and was forced to return home without firing. The fleet continued on, now more alert for minefields. Unfortunately for them, what they now needed was to be alert for enemy submarines, and issues with sonar detection in Cyclone and Epervier led to the inability to detect U-20 prowling for Allied ships. A torpedo spread was sent into the French portion of the fleet. The tender Jules Verne escaped due to a happenstance maneuver, while battleship Condorcet took a torpedo hit, killing many, but not sending the battleship down. Less lucky was the transport Marshal Joffre, bringing along 800 men, which was hit by yet another torpedo, sending her below the waves as survivors attempted to reach safety. French destroyer Typhon raced to counterattack U-20, dropping depth charges above her locations. These charges detonated above the required depth, and U-20 was able to escape from Typhon and return home with a successful kill. Troubles were not over for the Allied fleet, as on the British side, minesweeper Halcyon and sloop Pelican each overlooked a mine, sinking both immediately. Still on high alert and in the midst of rescuing survivors, an aircraft was detected in the night sky. Furious launched 2 Gladiators with orders to engage immediately. The fighters intercepted their target, a new German BV-138 bomber, and shot it to pieces, crashing into the water below. Though it was able to fight back, the Germans did not expect an aircraft carrier to accompany the fleet. No sooner had the bomber been shot down than scouts had begun to report sightings of a Morgana fleet to the north. 2 enemy ships immediately exploded, either to minefields or torpedoes. Furious readied 3 full attack squadrons of swordfish and expertly attacked the Morgana fleet, receiving only a smattering of anti-aircraft fire in return. Much of the first wave of torpedoes missed their marks as the destroyers and cruisers evaded them, but the first wave of swordfish managed to sink 1 heavy cruiser and 1 destroyer. The second wave saw the loss of only 1 Morgana, while a now alerted enemy downed 3 swordfish in return. The third wave saw the loss of a swordfish to a direct hit from Injustice, and was forced to retreat from the anti-aircraft fire before dropping torpedoes. The Morgana continued to charge forward even while losing ships to the mines. Some military officers believed it was a coordinated attack between the Morganas and the Germans, while others disagreed. Dawn broke, and the Morgana fleet approached. The British and French navies opened fire. Heavy cruiser Foch decisively sunk a light cruiser, and Condorcet scored a surprising hit herself. French cruiser Dupleix landed a friendly fire shot on the British merchant ship Worcester, with a Morgana torpedo sending the ship beneath the waves. Only 4 of her crew were rescued. and resulted in furious antagonism between the British and French fleets. The Swordfish had now returned to Furious and confirmed that the Morgana fleet numbered just under 20 ships, and was led by a mistrust. She was dressed in the armor of Oliver Cromwell. It was around this time that the merchant ship Scotsdown awakened her bell, either in mourning over her lost sister, or anger that the Morgana would take the visage of Cromwell. The Royal Navy once again tore into the Morgana fleet, with the sloop Black Swan herself awakening to strike a calamity between the eyes. Undeterred, the Morgana fleet continued to charge, unleashing a torpedo strike into the Allied fleet and sinking 5 ships. Merchant ships Patroclus, Salopian, and Meloia, the sloop Flamingo, and destroyer Verity. The fighting continued as yet another injustice hit a mine and sank instantly, but the cheers of the British sailors were cut short aboard Auckland when Black Swan and Fleetwood hit yet more mines. Fleetwood's damage was fatal, while Black Swan survived only thanks to her newly awakened bell, now sporting a terrible black scorch on her hull. Auckland's crew quickly began to rescue survivors from the cold waters. In the next volley, French cruiser Tourville struck the British sloop Bittern, fueling more outrage between the two navies. Even so, their combined fire remained on the Morgana fleet. Their return fire damaged the armed merchant Corfu, whose boiler then combusted, crippling her movement. As Nelson continued to attack, the Morgana fleet began to flee, but this did not stop the Allies, who rained shell after shell on the retreating enemy, sinking many as they fled. In the final volley, the Royal Navy and Condorcet fired as accurately as they could, determined to kill the leading mistrust. Merchant ship Derbyshire took an extraordinary shot, hurling a leather football over 5 nautical miles alongside a shell, striking Mistrust in the head and sending her to the depths. The Allies had won. Following the battle, merchant ship Wolf reported heavy damage to her superstructure, and the fleet arranged for her to tow Corfu back to port. They returned safely to the Shetlands. As the 2 ships departed, another reconnaissance aircraft was spotted overhead, and Furious returned 6 Gladiators to the sky. They quickly identified it as another German patrol aircraft, a Doe 24, and quickly shot it down as it failed to return fire and was forced into a hard landing. As the Gladiators returned, they spotted Morgana aircraft approaching from the north, while Minesweeper Jason and Destroyer Whitehall were lost as they helped clear the minefield below. As the Allied fleet tended to its wounds and rescued survivors, 3 French transports took torpedo hits from U-46, who had been waiting for them. Flandre went down with nearly all the equipment of the 44th Pioneers. Athos, carrying 2,500 of the 3rd North African Infantry, was the second ship to go down, and Champlain III, a particularly devastating blow with the loss of the 145th Artillery. The bell of U-46 celebrated her success as the U-boat slipped away, as the Allied fleet was too busy rescuing survivors. She opted not to pursue Wolf and Corfu and returned to home port. Above the fleet, the Gladiators engaged a dozen Morgana aircraft advancing on the fleet. The planes are surprisingly resilient, with only 1 being down before the Gladiators were forced to return for rearming. Furious's second fighter wing relieved them in order to finish the job. A dogfight ensued, with the bombers returning fire, but the Gladiators were able to down all but 3, while only losing 1 of their own. The remaining bombers were quickly eradicated by Allied anti-aircraft fire before they could do any damage. After much effort, the Allied fleet had cleared the German minefield. Scout planes were launched from all available craft, with the British heading north and south while the French searched east. They observed the daily bustle of Norwegian life, as fishing trawlers and cargo ships lazily plugged along. The evening sunset proved a spectacular view. To the north, aerial reconnaissance spotted a dozen Morgana aircraft staying just out of range of the fleet. Reporting their findings, the fleet determined at least 1 Morgana carrier was shadowing them. A nearby German BV-138 detected the French aircraft, and as both sides radioed their findings, Interception took note of their receptions. They also detected a message from British command, notifying that the battleship Scharnhorst had been previously moored in Kiel but now was vacant. Furious once again launched her Gladiators, now repaired and refueled, who quickly intercepted the dozen bombers, now incoming towards the fleet. Explosions lit up the sky, and 11 of the 12 bombers were down, with the loss of only a single Gladiator. The final bomber retreated into the night. The lost Gladiator pilot was rescued shortly thereafter. With a break in the fighting, Allied intelligence scrambled to determine the location and intent of Scharnhorst. It was highly possible that the battleship had been sent to intercept them, but no sign of her had been reported by their scouts. Instead, a final aerial daylight raid had been sighted coming from the Morgana in the north, while the southern patrol detected a German minesweeper heading toward Bergen. A sortie of French aircraft flew near the town of Hitra, spotting not only a pair of German reconnaissance aircraft, but a U-boat pack as well. Poor identification led to the U-boats attempting to signal to the French, who soon realized what they had uncovered and attempted to bomb the U-boats with depth charges. None were successful and the U-boats retreated to safety. Back in the north, Furious launched a wave of Gladiators to intercept the final Morgana attack, and a wave of Swordfish to the south, to destroy either the Minesweeper or Scharnhorst if the rumors were to be believed. The Gladiators went in to attack the bombers, but were unprepared for their escort. Morgana fighters turned the table on the Gladiators, who brought down 5 bombers but were reduced to just 3 fighters themselves. Thanks to their early warning, the Allied fleet was ready with anti-aircraft fire. 5 fighters were cut down immediately, but this allowed the remaining bombers to drop their torpedoes. Javelin and Jackal expertly avoided the torpedoes dropped on them, and AA fire claimed several more Morgana aircraft. Even so, the Morgana were now driving their planes directly into the British ships. The bomber that had missed Jackal now opted to fly straight into her superstructure. The damage was great, as the entire forward section was ripped clean off. In the chaos, another Morgana bomber landed a torpedo hit on Sheffield, who was wounded but able to remain afloat thanks to her bell's resilience. Further AA downed the remainder of the Morgana aircraft, and Jackal was ordered to return to base. She later met up with Corfu and Wolfe. British sailors took to calling these attacks Irish taxis. Back in the south, Furious's Swordfish stumbled upon at least 6 German warships. They made a desperate bombing run and landed 5 hits against an unidentified enemy warship. Having survived 3 hits, it was guessed to be either Scharnhorst or Hipper, and this, along with the sinking of a German minesweeper, started the Swordfish's reputation as a battleship killer, having lost none of their own. German and Norwegian reports would show that R-18 and R-17, a pair of minesweepers, were working with the local Norwegian forces to clear a minefield, and the so-called flotilla was merely the meager defensive AA fire the ships had been armed with. It had little effect on the Swordfish, who returned for more attacks, detonating mines with their torpedoes along the way. Eventually, R-17 was hit and sank beneath the waves. The last 2 Swordfish turned to attack one of the Norwegian ships, an unarmed trawler, and dropped torpedoes on the helpless ship, blowing it to pieces and killing all 6 civilians on board, including Captain Arne Asmussen, who would later be recovered by Norwegian authorities. Back at the British fleet, U-21, U-23, and U-24 silently crept up on the fleet and detected what was believed to be an aircraft carrier. They took aim and fired a spread of torpedoes, but missed their target, instead hitting the pier of the village of Onafir. This mishap alerted the Allied fleet, as well as the village, to the presence of a U-boat. Even so, torpedoes from U-21 would strike Black Swan, sending the Belle back to Scapa Flow, heavily damaged. French escort La Pomone was also hit, and without the protection of a Belle, was blown to pieces. Roused to action, the fleet quickly began anti-submarine measures, crushing both U-23 and U-24, with only U-21 barely surviving and later claimed to have sunk HMS Furious, though this was not the case. The villagers of Onafir were unaware of this engagement, and their tales became one of the singular terror of the British and French upon Norwegian shores. As dawn broke on the second day of the invasion, the French fleet separated from the British fleet. Visibility was poor, and a scouting plane crashed into a rocky cliff, but the crew was able to bail out and be rescued shortly after. The Norwegians did not spot them, but a pack of German U-boats did, only to be soon detected by French sonar. U-56, U-58, and U-59 quickly discovered they had been spotted, and began evasive measures as the French began dropping depth charges from the air. Two of the submarines managed to launch their torpedoes, but U-56 was trapped among the islands and destroyed. U-58 managed to sink the transport Barfleur, carrying the 800 men of the 3rd North African, and the large destroyer Epervier, while also damaging Condorcet further before being destroyed as well. U-59 avoided attack by Bougainville before sinking the escort ship Commander de Lage and transport El Mansur, carrying 1,000 men of the 3rd North African. She was unable to save U-58, but escaped with only light damage. The French believed all 3 U-boats sunk after Cyclone detected no further contacts. 4 survivors from the submarines managed to escape to nearby Norwegian farmhouses. The British, meanwhile, had been up to tricks of their own. 15 submarines had executed advanced landing operations in the fjords around Narvik and Lofoten, dropping off commandos to secure British landing sites in advance. Despite the loss of Tetrarch, Taku, and Tribune, the remaining submarines were able to execute their tasks. The only Norwegian troops who had noticed the commandos were those in Bogen, pinning down the British in the nearby post office, but unable to radio for help as a result. As British reinforcements arrived, the tides quickly turned on the Norwegians. All other raids were executed perfectly, and the commandos cut down many Norwegians while they slept. It was not until midday that anything was discovered to be amiss by the greater part of Norway. As the fog lifted around Garten, observers were stunned to discover dozens of French warships on their coast. 2 scout planes were seen, one searching for the French fleet and another, a German BV-138, returning south with news for high command. By now, French aerial reconnaissance had detected puffs of white smoke around them, a sign that the Norwegians had begun their retaliation. A fortress in the mountains to the southeast of the fleet erupted in gunfire as batteries opened up on them. The Norwegians only managed to score a single hit, striking Suffren in her right flank. Cursing the Norwegians, the French fleet retaliated against the mountain guns, and as Condorcet released an observation blimp, both sides exchanged fire to limited effect. The guns of the French caused the Norwegians to panic, and their shooting grew worse, while Condorcet's blimp ranged in the guns more and more until the mountain guns of the fort were finally silenced. Anti-aircraft fire was utterly ineffective against them. The French were spared attack from the second fort, unmanned as of that day, as the garrison was celebrating the birth of a soldier's daughter, likely sparing their lives. As the British fleet pushed on, scouts reported another large Morgana fleet approaching them from the north. As the British prepared to engage them, several formations of Morgana aircraft approached from the west. Anti-aircraft batteries opened up, but to little effect. Thankfully, the Morgana aircraft also had limited success in pinning down the AA. The British threw everything they had at the Morgana, only to discover a surprising level of tactics from Morgana. As fighters pinned AA, so torpedo bombers could drop, while Morgana dive bombers singled out Furious. Even so, their inaccuracy was as prevalent as ever, and no torpedoes scored a hit. As the dive bombers went for Furious, her remaining gladiators took to the skies and fought like avenging angels. Dive bombers were torn apart, forcing the Morgana to resort to crude suicide attacks. Both destroyers Fame and Firedrake were hit, as was Juno, but no ships were lost. As the fleet formed around Furious, the aircraft were entirely cut down from the sky. Just as the aircraft ceased their attack, the Northern Morgana fleet were coming into range. At the same time, in the south, the French destroyer sent Elan and his destroyer Cyclone ahead to scout the next bend in the fjord towards Trondheim. As the city came into view, the French spotted a hastily laid minefield by the mine layer Froya, escorted by torpedo boat Sleipner. The Norwegians engaged the French fleet. The Norwegians attacked, damaging Elan. Sleipner attempted a torpedo attack, but her crew failed to properly arm the torpedoes, leading to an ineffective attack. Elan and Cyclone returned fire, blasting the destroyer's main gun apart. In the cramped conditions of the fjord, only the large destroyer Vauban was able to provide backup. The three ships riddled the Norwegian vessels full of holes, and Froya was sent beneath the waves. As Sleipner reloaded her torpedoes correctly, she prepared another attack, but a malfunction in one of the tubes caused a catastrophic detonation, tearing the ship apart. Those who were not killed instantly scrambled to flee the doomed vessel. Sleipner's remaining torpedo sailed into Vauban, who survived this blast thanks to her large size, but not the mine she sailed into, fatally striking the destroyer. Elan and Cyclone rescued both French and Norwegian survivors, while Minesweeper Castor cleared the field. As the fleet sailed closer to their destination, they rescued their earlier scout plane's pilot as well. Back in the north, the British opened fire. As large as the Morgana force was, the British still outnumbered them and had capital ship support. The Morgana were the first to land a hit, striking Minesweeper Hussar, but the British were the first to claim a kill, sending a calamity to her doom. Aboard the heavy cruiser Norfolk, a wave of despair swept through the vessel, ceasing her fire to the confusion of the British. Strangely, an enemy despair also ceased firing in response to this gloom. As officers took in the scene, they put two and two together, and realized the despair at the center of the fleet was the cause of this effect, just as the mistrust earlier had caused chaos between the French and British. As word was spread through the fleet, the battleship Royal Sovereign fell under despair's effect, ceasing her fire while some crew began to take their own lives. The Royal Navy did not let this stop them, as Nelson took charge and boldly proposed to charge the Morgana, allowing a full broadside to be used against them for maximum effect. All 53 ships fired at once, and the awesome display woke those affected by despair from their rut. Only a single Morgana was destroyed, but no ship survived without injury. Furious launched more swordfish, and as shells continued to rain down on the Morgana, two more bells awoke, destroyers Faulkner and Foxhound. Even when the destroyer Wanderer was destroyed, the morale from these events did not diminish. The British closed in for the kill, slaughtering countless Morgana at close range. Damage was exchanged at both sides, and the destroyer Jersey was sunk. Torpedoes were fired, and Sheffield received an otherwise killing blow, save thanks only to her bell retreating to Scapa Flow at the last moment. Perhaps realizing the possibility of severe loss, the British ordered all damaged ships to retreat, but the Morgana did not let them escape without a fight. Merchant ship Scotsdown was forced to make an emergency escape home. The destroyer Forester and sloop Bittern were not as lucky, sinking beneath the waves. The remaining injured destroyers Juno, Hussar, Fame, and Foresight all escaped to various British ports. With the wounded evacuated, the British launched torpedoes at the remaining ships, while the Swordfish completed the pincer attack. This, combined with the relentless gunfire, destroyed all but two Morgana, the lead Despair and a lone companion. Destroyer stood atop her ship as if a mourning widow from Victorian times, lamenting the sad state of humanity. The British were not amused, and swiftly ended both Morgana. By the time 1 o'clock in the afternoon had rolled around, the events of Trondheim had reached the rest of Norway. King Haakon VII was informed of an invasion by the Allies, having anticipated one by them or the Axis. General alarm was sounded and the Royal Council convened to determine their next steps. Naval patrols from Narmik and Tromsø ready to fight off incursions near the second French landing site of Bodo, while the French fleet at Trondheim sailed into a carefully laid trap. Transport ship Quercy struck another mine as the fleet neared Trondheim while the fjord opened into a small lake. The fleet halted and cast their move to clear the mines. It was then that the Norwegians sprung their trap as the Trondheim fortress opened up its guns. Minesweepers Glommen and Laugen moved to support it, but the French vessels were too strong of opponents, and the Norwegians scored no critical hits. The French retaliated, dispatching Glommen quickly, and while the fortress continued to land glancing blows, the French were able to quickly destroy Laugen, down an aerial recon plane, and silence the fortress's guns. With resistance quashed, the French landed their troops in Trondheim. By 4 o'clock, General Hunsinger had cabled to Paris to report the fall of the city, and that he would hold it until reinforcements arrived. Light defenses within the city were swiftly eliminated, and the French were able to fortify their position. An hour later, a similar report reached Paris from Bode, while the only Norwegian defensive ship, the patrol vessel Nordkapp, had instead defected to the French's side, perhaps realizing their unwinnable odds. The city was taken without a shot as local forces laid down their arms in front of the French invaders. Those who cooperated were labeled traitorous Bodanger, while those who resisted were labeled Askoyer, termed after the namesake island supported Germany after a minesweeper supported them in clearing a minefield and returning bodies from the destroyed fishing trawler. Stories from this event were spread throughout the province. As Bodo surrendered, news spread that Scharnhorst would not threaten the invasion fleet, having instead been sent to sack Denmark on Germany's behalf. By the time Trondheim fell, the Norwegian cabinet issued an apology to the German embassy, but did not request military assistance. They also confirmed the invasion to the Germans, citing Chamberlain's ultimatum to halt trade with Germany. Diplomatic exchanges were had between Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, and soon after, Norway officially declared war on the Allies. As the Norwegian military fully activated in response to the invasion, activity in the port of Narvik, where an international coalition of forces was stationed at Norway's request, spiked to unprecedented levels. Norwegian aircraft and ships sailed out to meet the invaders, while local INPF naval forces coordinated under Japanese Admiral Inoue. Having readied a defensive strategy, but not yet knowing the full circumstances, the patrolling Italian ships in the fjord began to pull back towards the port in order to station themselves around battleship Fuso, by far the largest vessel in the area. Britain became aware of this through submarine intelligence, and the Norwegians warned the INPF about their defensive minefield against the would-be attackers, who were now entering the Ottofjord. As the Italian and Japanese ships took up position around Fuso, everyone waited with bated breath to see what would happen next. Merchant ship Rawalpindi remained in her port pleading ignorance, while the Italian soldiers mustered their tankettes. British troops and German troops remained holed up in their barracks. As the British fleet entered the fjord, gunfire was heard in the direction of Bogen, where a small defensive garrison was attempting to repel British commandos. The Norwegian coastal battleship Norge was stationed in the area and attempted to intervene. Though she attempted to drive off the commandos, her aim was insufficient to make a difference. The tides threatened to turn when a squadron of Japanese destroyers investigated the gunfire, as the thick fog had made identification difficult. The Norwegians were able to radio Narvik and alert the INPF to the situation. These circumstances led to the British reaching the mine barrier without incident. To their surprise, they encountered the Italian cruiser Bari, who herself was unable to identify them through the fog and signaled for identification. Rodney gave a reply. "This is battleship HMS Rodney of the Royal Navy. We are heading into the fjord to secure the area. Respectfully, stand aside." Tense seconds were had, as Bari relayed the message and waited for a reply from Inoue. "This is Kaigun Shosho Shigeyoshi Inoue, commander of the IJN Narvik Naval Contingent. Do not move past the villages of Kielda before informing the INPF forces of your intentions. There is a minefield between Kielda, and you will collide with that if you proceed carelessly. Attempting to sweep the minefield or push through without consulting the INPF will be taken as hostile intent." Also present at Narvik, though most had forgotten, was the Soviet destroyer Gromki, who had a message for Buso. She had spotted several British ships in the fog, at least 2 battleships as well as destroyers and minesweepers. She was able to report on the situation to the north, as well as Norway's declaration of war against the Allies, and Denmark's alignment with Germany. Inoue asked for confirmation from his Norwegian allies, who told him, 30 minutes ago, the Kingdom of Norway declared war against all 3 perfidious Entente members. They have seized Trondheim. Norwegians will never surrender to invaders, whoever they may be. We are currently fighting hostile forces who landed last night. Long live the king! Inoue could only shake his head and lamented the foolishness under his breath. Rodney soon issued another message for Inoue. This is Admiral Sir Charles Forbes, commanding Rodney and this fleet. Will you have been content to sit on your hands within the safety of Norwegian fjords? We have been doing the job the INPF has claimed to be doing. We engaged and sunk 2 Morgana fleets that were marauding out here, and we have been harried by a Morgana carrier since the Faroes. The Germans too have been working in concert, sending their planes, U-boats, and other warships to engage us. Norway's way of repaying us for this is to declare war upon us. We are to secure the area around Narvik, but avoid the port itself. Now, we are on the timetable and I will not permit more lives to die due to INPF incompetence. Stand aside, or we will make you stand aside. Moments after, minesweepers Gleaner and Salamander began to move to clear the minefield. We have men under naval gunfire who need immediate assistance, Forbes continued. We cannot delay any further. We are proceeding. Sensing the inevitable, Inoue made one last appeal to the Norwegians. To the Norwegian commander, and all Norwegian vessels present, this is your last chance to avoid catastrophe. Cease fire. Buying time is the best thing you can do for your country at this juncture. Only the mine layer Vale heeded this advice, while the Italians tried to do the same, only to convince 2 seaplanes to return. Coastal battleship Eidsvold sailed past the INPF flotilla, and attempted to engage the Royal Navy alone. She had courage but not the skills to make an impact, and it became painfully clear to Inoue what he had to do. He signaled for his fleet to return to Narvik, giving the British a clear line of fire at the vessel and the fjord. Inoue gave a final message to the British. Admiral Forbes, I fear history will not look kindly on your actions to the Nay. Nonetheless, it is our mandate to prevent bloodshed where possible. Do what you must to protect your men, but if you approach the INPF again without consultation, we will open fire. Our conversations are not over. As Eidsvold attacked the Royal Navy, she managed to score a hit on Gleaner, though not a crippling one. Grompi too tried to appeal to the Norwegians, but as she called out to them, the Royal Navy unleashed a devastating broadside at Eidsvold, and a magazine detonation ripped the ship apart. As sailors took in the scene, a torpedo struck the destroyer Javelin, fired from the hidden Norwegian submarine B-3, but her bell proved resilient enough to absorb the damage and limped towards the landing site at Balan. Most did not even witness the hit, as one of the B-3's torpedoes misfired in the tube, destroying the submarine with a mighty plume of water, marking a tragic end to the encounter. As the British continued down the fjord, they landed troops at Balan, while their northern attack ran into Norwegian defenders. Norge was firing on British troops on the shore, and so the British dispatched their flotilla to engage her, led by cruisers Norfolk and Aurora. Aurora's gunfire was so wild, she ended up causing the only casualties among the British commandos, who were securing Bogan. The remainder of the British ships were able to punch holes in Norge, who clumsily attempted to reposition herself. Destroyer Jaguar took pity and requested she surrender, but Norfolk and Aurora took no chances and utterly destroyed the battleship, and the British were able to take Bogan. A third British contingent pushed toward Hakvik, dangerously close to Narvik. There, they ran into the disgruntled INPF fleet once more. Royal Sovereign broadcast to them. This is the battleship HMS Royal Sovereign of the Royal Navy. We are headed to Hakvik, stand aside. Bari issued a reply. Royal Sovereign, this is Bari. Your troops have legs. We have our orders and will not dishonor them. Please do not press further. No more lives need to be lost today. We have commandos at Hakvik who need reinforcement. Would you have us abandon them? Royal Sovereign asked. At this point, Admiral Inoue interjected. Royal Sovereign, this is Kaigan Shosho Shigenoshi Inoue aboard Fuso. Can you confirm whether the ground troops you were escorting to Hakvik have heavy artillery? After a pause, a response was given. We do not have heavy artillery. Permission was granted to the British. Your command and transports may pass. Please inform Admiral Forbes that he has run out of excuses to delay continuing our conversation. As the ships move, Rodney reached out to Fuso. Fuso, this is Rodney. I am transmitting a message on behalf of Admiral of the Fleet, Lord Quirk, currently aboard Aurora. Lord Quirk's message is as follows. Please convey my appreciation to our Japanese colleagues for coming to their senses, and my apologies for the lack of tact from Admiral Sir Forbes. When one has run a gauntlet like we have, it is understandable that nerves are frayed. He has the best intentions and is looking out for all Britons under his command. If you desire conversation, we may have it on neutral ground, perhaps with a drink to try and soothe tempers and cool heads. However, you must excuse Admiral Sir Forbes for the moment, as he has duties to attend to. I will trust you will advise your Italian compatriots to permit the rest of our fleet to pass. On a personal note from me, I wish that this may have been under better circumstances, but mine and Nelson's duties are to king and country above all else. All I hope for is a swift end to Herr Hitler and Nazi Germany, so that we may redirect our efforts to the Morgana, and this promises to help do so. The quicker we're done here, the quicker we can put this behind us and deal with the Morgana. A decision was made and this message is sent to INPF ships. Royal Sovereign and her ships will be allowed to pass. Admiral of the Fleet, Lord Quirk. This is Kaigan Shoshin Shigeyoshi Inoue. The Kami of Fuso is currently engaged in satisfactory dialogue with the Kami of Rodney, but I want to make this red line clear to the senior Royal Navy commander present in this fjord. If there is any action from the British Armed Forces during your hostilities with Norway that endangers the personal safety of any member of the INPF force at Narvik or any Norwegian civilian or serviceman within the neutrality zone, there will be dire consequences. So long as you stay out of Narvik proper as promised and let the INPF and the League of Nations take responsibility for policing the actions of those inside the neutrality zone, currently I see no reason why our forces wouldn't be able to operate in the same body of water. Also, you and Admiral Forbes would be well advised to inform one of our INPF senior officers present if any issues that could complicate our relationship going forward. Not many present here amongst my command are willing to extend renewed trust to the Royal Navy after being blindsided so severely. Push the limits of their cooperation at your own peril. Fuso gave these words significant thought and knew she had to protect Narvik and the soldiers there. Please listen, Kami of HMS Rodney. This port and its people are under my protection. They are not here to harm you or cause you peril. If you must enter the port, it would be best if you conduct your business and depart swiftly. You should try not to use this place as a battlefield, because my fleet is here to fight the Morgana, not other humans. We cannot stand in the way of your conquest, but it is clear now that it is inevitable. Again, perform your repairs in port and leave quickly. The people here will not find you welcome guests anymore. As a cold silence filled the radio wave, the INPF fleet returned to Narvik, and the British completed their landings in the fjord. Having secured their objectives in the Otto Fjord, the British now sailed towards northern Lofoten and Andfjord, enjoying a calmer voyage than before. Soon, they drifted into heavy fog, but British seamanship brought them exactly where they intended anyways. Now joining them were 8 additional ships, Morgana light cruisers. To add to the confusion, a small Norwegian flotilla out of Tromsø joined to watch the spectacle. Submarines were spotted to the north and south. 3 German U-boats under the command of U-37 had also stumbled into the area. They were impossibly lost, and while normally would enjoy such pickings, were in no position to ambush the British. A Morgana voice broke through the silence, inquiring where her monstrous sisters and the human navies were. Nelson and her crew were busy enjoying biscuits and tea. The destroyers Fortune, Firedrake, and Witch reported underwater contacts, eagerly set out to work flushing them out. The cruisers Belfast and Edinburgh, as well as destroyers Foxhound, Derbyshire, and Faulkner, had a sense that something was amiss, but their bells could not pin down what. What it was the German U-boats snapping photographs of the fleet amidst the Morganas, perfect material for propaganda back home. Realizing the value of what they had obtained and the danger they were in, they began to retreat. U-37 felt a knock into her hull, and dumped some debris from one of her tubes to trick the British into thinking she had been killed. They engaged in silent running and successfully slipped away from the British. The Royal Navy broadcast on INPF frequencies to fly INPF colors to avoid being fired upon. The Norwegian patrol vessels Fridtjof Nansen and Heimdall returned home under their own flag, while torpedo boat Trigg lingered slightly longer. None flew INPF colors. As this ultimatum was issued, the Royal Navy soon realized there were Morgana in their midst. The 5 Bells opened fire, with foxhounds striking a very confused confusion, whose cry led to the remaining Morgana firing in every direction except at Nelson, whose crews were enjoying tea and biscuits. Chaos followed as the British and Morgana both fired wildly in all directions as shells and bullets raked the waters. Trigg launched her 2 torpedoes before slipping back to Tromsø. They ultimately vanished harmlessly into the mist, but some hasty photographs would eventually circulate through Norwegian newspapers. Despite the chaos, the Royal Navy successfully dispatched the Morgana. Though no ship was without damage, none were lost, as with each sunken Morgana, the British aim became clearer and clearer. Many wept and were grateful to have survived the so-called Mad Arctic shootout. For Nelson's part, the crew was entirely oblivious to the whole event, likely due to confusion's influence. Explaining to both her captain and Bell what had happened was a significant task. After the fight, the remainder of the British invasion went off without incident, as troops landed in various locations. At Seovigen, the commandos and landing troops encountered resistance, but it was quickly overcome, and by nightfall, the British and France had secured their objectives. The Allied powers, led by Britain and France, had successfully invaded the neutral country of Norway, in order to deny Germany the ability to benefit from trade stemming from the nation. As a result, Norway has declared war on the Allies, and Sweden nervously looks to its western border. The Germans have successfully staged a coup against Denmark thanks to Scharnhorst, who is now aligned with the fascist nation. Fighting over land continues, and at this time the situation is unresolved. The journey to Norway was fraught with peril and exacted a heavy toll on the Allies. Britain suffered the loss of 5 destroyers, 5 scouting vessels, 3 submarines, 2 minesweepers, and 4 sloops. 3 ships suffered severe damage, while 7 sustained minor damage, necessitating notable repairs. 7 Bells awoke during the course of the invasion. Javelin, Faulkner, Foxhound, Triton, Scotsdown, Black Swan, and Derbyshire. 40,000 troops successfully landed in Norway. France suffered the losses of 2 transport ships, 5 armed merchants, 2 large destroyers, 1 small destroyer, a minesweeper, and 3 scouts. Close to 75,000 troops successfully landed in Norway. Time will tell what diplomatic and military repercussions these events will have on the Second World War, Morgana War, and the world at large. Will the democracies look the other way in the face of German aggression, or will the Allies be harshly condemned? Will Sweden align with Germany to keep out the aggressors? How will the INPF tolerate such a blatant attack on their mission statement? There is only one way to see, and that is to follow the story of Victory Bells, a player-driven campaign of bold ambitions, hard choices, and alternate history. Thank you for listening.